Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to install a brand new, high-tech operating system in your mind. We're ditching the idea that the economy is just this chaotic, confusing mess of money and markets. Instead, we're going to look at it through the sharp, objective lens of a true scientist. That's right, we are going to learn how to think like an economist.
Albert Einstein actually hit the nail on the head when he said, "The whole of science is nothing more than the refinement of everyday thinking." You know, a lot of people tend to dismiss economics as just boring math or abstract finance, but by elevating it to a scientific discipline, we can see what it truly is: a brilliant, systematic way to refine our everyday transactions and choices into clear, understandable data. Economists don't use test tubes or telescopes, right? Their laboratory is the real world.
Okay, let's initialize this new toolkit. Here is our agenda. 1. Economics as a science. 2. The power of assumptions. 3. Economic models. 4. The production possibilities frontier. 5. Microeconomics versus macroeconomics. And finally, 6. Positive versus normative analysis.
Let's jump right into Section 1, Economics as a Science.
Now, it might surprise you, but economists actually approach the world with the exact same dispassionate objectivity as a physicist studying matter. It all comes down to the scientific method. Think about that famous story of Isaac Newton. He sees an apple fall from a tree. That's an observation. That single event sparks a theory about gravity, which he and others then test with even more observation. Well, economists do the exact same thing. They might observe society, say, noticing rapid price increases in a certain country. They develop a theory about inflation, and then they collect massive amounts of data on prices and money supply to test if their theory actually holds up.
All right, moving to Section 2, the power of assumptions, or really, deciding what matters.
The true art of scientific thinking is knowing exactly which details you need to just filter out. Imagine a physicist dropping a marble off the top of a building. To figure out how fast it falls, they'll probably assume it's falling in a vacuum, completely ignoring wind resistance. For a tiny, dense marble, that assumption works perfectly. It simplifies the math without ruining the answer. But what if they drop a beach ball? It's huge and light. If they assume there's no friction, their calculation is going to be completely wrong. The assumption that works flawlessly for the marble absolutely fails for the beach ball. You've got to change your assumptions depending on the specific problem you're trying to solve.
And economists apply this exact same marble and beach ball logic. Let's say the government suddenly pumps a bunch of new dollars into circulation. How do prices respond? Well, it depends entirely on your time horizon. In the short run, like the price of a magazine at a newsstand today, prices basically don't change. So making the slightly artificial assumption that all prices are completely fixed is incredibly useful for short-run analysis. But if we're looking at the long run, say over a decade, we have to drop that assumption because prices become flexible. This is literally why you see economists contradicting each other on the news. They're just assuming totally different time horizons.
Let's look at Section 3, Economic Models.
You know those plastic biology mannequins? The ones that leave out all the tiny capillaries so you can easily see the heart and lungs? Economic models do the exact same thing for reality. Take the circular flow diagram. Think of it as this dynamic, two-loop, holographic model tracking the heartbeat of the economy. First, we identify our two main actors: households and firms. Then, we place them into two markets: the market for goods and services and the market for the factors of production, which is really just a fancy way of saying labor, land, and capital. Finally, we track the flows. The outer loop is all about dollars. Households spend money buying goods from firms, and firms use that money to pay wages back to the households. The inner loop tracks the actual stuff. Households sell their labor to firms, and firms use that labor to produce goods that go back to the households. It strips away all the messy details to show us the economy's core engine.
Okay, on to Section 4, the production possibilities frontier. This mathematical model maps out the absolute ultimate economic reality: trade-offs. It's called the production possibilities frontier, or PPF. Imagine an economy that only produces two things: computers on the vertical axis and cars on the horizontal axis. Point A is sitting right on the curve, representing maximum efficiency. At point A, we're turning out 600 cars and 2,200 computers. But what if society suddenly decides it wants more cars? To move from point A down the curve to point B and get 700 cars, we actually have to give up some computers. Production drops down to 2,000. That right there visualizes opportunity cost. To get 100 more cars, we had to sacrifice 200 computers. The slope of this curve is literally calculating the opportunity cost for us. Let's pull out the core dynamics here. As long as you are on that curve, your economy is perfectly efficient, and you're dealing with trade-offs. But what if you're stuck inside the curve? That represents an inefficient economy, maybe due to high unemployment where resources are just sitting idle. But here is the really amazing part. This model actually visualizes economic growth. If there is a massive technological breakthrough in the computer industry, the entire frontier shifts outward. Suddenly, without adding a single new worker, the absolute limit of what society can produce just expands. Think about how the internet or AI revolutionized productivity. That outward shift is what economic growth actually looks like.
Moving to Section 5, Micro versus Macroeconomics.
So how do we actually apply these models? Well, we use two very distinct lenses. First up, we have the micro lens. Microeconomics is the study of how individual households and firms make decisions in specific markets. If you're analyzing how rent control affects housing in New York City, or looking at the impact of foreign competition on the U.S. auto industry, you are doing microeconomics. You are zooming in and looking incredibly closely at the individual trees.
But if you swap out that lens and zoom way out, you get macroeconomics. This is the study of economy-wide phenomena. We aren't looking at New York City housing anymore. We're looking at the total federal debt. We're looking at the national unemployment rate, or overall inflation. Now, obviously, micro and macro are totally intertwined, right? The national economy is really just millions of individual micro decisions added together. But because they are asking fundamentally different questions, they require completely different sets of models to find the answers.
Finally, Section 6, Positive versus Normative Analysis.
To truly think like an economist, you absolutely must learn to separate objective facts from personal values. Let's introduce a character from our source material. Portia, the scientist. Portia says, minimum wage laws cause unemployment. This is what economists call a positive statement. It's descriptive, it's a claim about how the world actually is. Now, whether you agree with Portia or not totally doesn't matter here. The key is that her statement can be strictly verified or refuted by examining hard data. We can literally go back, look at historical minimum wage hikes, and check the employment numbers to see if she's right.
Now let's meet Noah, the policy advisor. Noah makes a very different statement. The government should raise the minimum wage. This is a normative statement. It's prescriptive. It's a claim about how the world ought to be. And here's the thing. Noah's statement cannot be judged by data alone. Deciding what makes a good or bad policy involves ethics, philosophy, and your own personal values. Positive analysis tells you what will happen. Normative analysis is your own internal debate about whether that outcome is something you actually want.
This whole split between facts and values brings up a pretty classic punchline. President Harry Truman once famously complained, "I want to find a one-armed economist. When I ask my economists for advice, they always answer, on the one hand, on the other hand." It's funny, but it perfectly illustrates the inherent trade-offs in the economy. Economists almost never give simple, one-sided policy advice because the models, like the PPF we just looked at, prove that getting more of one thing practically always means giving up something else.
So here's the big takeaway for your brand new analytical toolkit. You now know how to apply the scientific method, how to filter reality through assumptions, how to build models, and how to swap between micro and macro lenses. But honestly, the most important thing is knowing the difference between a statement of fact and a statement of values. Next time you hear a politician on the news quoting an economist to support a new law, stop and ask yourself, are they speaking as a scientist describing reality, or are they acting as an advisor telling you how they think things ought to be? Keep this toolkit handy, and I promise you the news will never look the same again. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.